On a hot Hong Kong evening on the 20th of July 1973, just before 10:30 p.m, an ambulance makes its way through busy Hong Kong traffic to a Kowloon apartment. They've received a report of an unconscious and unresponsive 32-year-old male at a second-floor apartment at 67 Beacon Hill Road, Kowloon. On arriving at the apartment, they find a distraught woman, Betty Ting Pei, a middle-aged man, Raymond Chow, and the doctor who placed the call for an ambulance, Dr. Eugene Chu Po-Hui. The apartment was like any other normal one-bedroom apartment in this part of Hong Kong, with its blue curtains and wooden floors, just another average apartment. On arrival, experienced paramedic Pang Tak Sun found a critically ill patient with no pulse or breath laying on Betty Ting Pei's bed and launched into action doing what he knew best. He immediately realised the gravity of the situation. Performing CPR on their critically ill patient, he was rapidly transferred to an ambulance, and just after 10:30 p.m, they made their way through the late-night Hong Kong traffic to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. In the back of this ambulance, Raymond Chow and Dr. Chu remained with this 32-year-old man. What was the name of the man? Lee Yun Fan, otherwise known to the world as Bruce Lee, the same Bruce Lee who was a Hong Kong megastar, growing international star, childhood star of Hong Kong cinema, and star of awesome kung fu movies of the late 1960s and early 1970s, which have become all-time classics like Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Way of the Dragon, and mega box office success Enter the Dragon that earned close to $1 billion posthumously. And in a matter of hours, the world would learn about his tragic death at the very young age of 32 years old from a cerebral edema. On arrival at Queen Elizabeth Hospital, Bruce Lee was immediately rushed into emergency where surgeons worked frantically to restart his heart, performing defibrillation and injecting drugs straight into his heart. But despite the best efforts of the emergency room medical team, the odds were stacked against them from the time that Bruce had arrived. Despite all their efforts, Bruce Lee was already dead when he was found by Betty Ting Pei from a cerebral edema. For those who are unfamiliar with cerebral edemas, they are the result of a buildup of fluid around the brain, causing increased pressure on the brain known as intracranial pressure. If you consider that the brain is located in your skull, which is hard bone, this means there's a limited amount of space within the skull. In what is known as the Monro-Keeley hypothesis, this says that the total bulk of three elements inside the skull, the brain, cerebral spinal fluid, and blood, is at all times constant. So if the volume of one of these components changes, it will force the reduction of the volume of the other components. Therefore, as more fluid enters into the skull, pressure builds up on your brain, known as intracranial pressure, and this then causes constriction in blood supply to the brain, which eventually begins to damage the brain and cause the brain to shut down, leading to cardiovascular failure. Cerebral edema is a treatable condition, but it needs to be treated as early as possible. By 11:30 p.m. that night, the news was spreading over Hong Kong. In 1973, there was no Twitter, no Facebook, and no internet. People got their news either in the paper, by watching the television, or on the radio. By midnight, reporters had already started gathering around Queen Elizabeth Hospital in disbelief. How could a 32-year-old star of cinema who was physically at his peak and with no known medical conditions suffer such a tragic death? There was a lot of speculation after Bruce Lee's death. Did he die of natural causes? Was it a drug overdose? Was there a curse on the Lee family? Did Bruce Lee's previous disputes with Hong Kong triads result in his murder? Well, what I will share with you today will change your view on a lot of things about Bruce Lee's death and may just surprise you with the warning signs that were in place well before he died. Things that, if dealt with early, may have saved his life. What I will say from the outset is Bruce Lee's death wasn't part of a conspiracy. There were no triads, it wasn't poisoning, it wasn't Japanese ninjas, it wasn't something sinister. Bruce Lee's death is explainable, and I will put forward a different explanation for his death compared to the questionable official explanation that Bruce Lee died from an allergic reaction to aspirin. My explanation will look objectively at a number of key facts around Bruce Lee's health, his previous medical history, and what we know today from the latest medical science, and will make you realize that the answer is so obvious. It will also confirm his death could have been avoided. So where do we start? Well, a good place to start is his last day, the 20th of July, 1973. It was a stifling hot day, but not untypical of Hong Kong in the middle of summer. The temperature hit 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius. Some would say balmy, but with 84% humidity, it was the hottest day of the month. Bruce started his day with energy. He was a naturally high energy person, and today was no exception, except his most recent days were filled with excitement and optimism. He was starting to find his purpose in life. I mean, he'd lived a pretty incredible life so far. Child movie star, kung fu master, teacher to Hollywood stars, and small part actor. But now he was becoming more than this. He had become an action star who was on the cusp of international movie fame. He had just completed another Hong Kong movie, Enter the Dragon, which is considered to be Bruce Lee's best kung fu movie and a sign of what the future could hold. Up to this point, it had been a hard slog. Nothing comes easy in life, and from the time Bruce had left Hong Kong, Bruce had worked hard to make a life in America. Now here he was at the start of something amazing, international fame. In front of him there were movie offers from Warner Brothers, opportunities to even start creating Bruce Lee merchandise like clothing, toys and books. Things were moving fast in Bruce Lee's life. Bruce liked to exercise in the morning, which is unsurprising given Bruce's obsession with physical well-being and a well-maintained physique. His morning routine usually involved stretching and cardio. He loved skipping rope and jogging, something he'd grown fond of from his early days training under Master Ip. His morning exercise out of the way, he then settled down to the demands of being a movie star. First stop was a visit to Golden Harvest Studios in Diamond Hill in Hong Kong. There he met with James Bond star George Lazenby, an Australian who had played Bond in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. They got together to discuss Lazenby's potential participation in Bruce's next movie, Game of Death. After meeting with Lazenby, Bruce then visited his friend and movie producer Raymond Chow, the same Raymond Chow who paramedics found in Betty Ting Pei's apartment later that evening. Bruce was lobbying for George Lazenby to be in his forthcoming movie, and Chow agreed and proposed a dinner that night to cement the deal and discuss specifics. Bruce then visited his friend Andre Morgan at the studio, who at the time was a movie producer, and something that he still does today. They indulged in some hashish, which Bruce regularly consumed either by eating the leaves straight or in cookies. After shooting the breeze for a while, Bruce Lee decided to cancel his lunch plans with George Lazenby and instead decided to visit his friend Betty Ting Pei's apartment. To some, Betty Ting Pei was considered to be a fellow actor, friend and confidant of Bruce Lee. But those on the inner circle knew that there was more to the friendship than just common interests and a shared vocation. As it would emerge sometime after Bruce's death, Betty Ting Pei was involved in an affair with the married Bruce Lee. So Bruce's visit to Betty Ting Pei's apartment was more than just a couple of friends catching up for a cup of tea. At around 1 p.m, Bruce Lee arrived at Betty Ting Pei's apartment in Kowloon. What happened next will never be known with certainty, but by Betty Ting Pei's account, they had sex and ate some hashish. Bruce Lee shared his excitement with Betty on meeting George Lazenby and was mulling over the potential audience that the Game of Death could reach with the inclusion of the now internationally known James Bond star. For 5 hours, Bruce and Betty were alone until 6 p.m. when Raymond Chow arrived. Why Chow visited the apartment at 6 p.m. is still clouded in mystery, and frankly, we'll probably never know as Raymond Chow died in 2018. One theory is that Raymond Chow and Andre Morgan had been waiting for Bruce to return from his lunchtime rendezvous with Betty Ting Pei so they could talk more about his deal with George Lazenby in the Game of Death. But realizing that Bruce wasn't coming back to the studio in a hurry that afternoon, given he was having such a good time with Betty, Raymond Chow came to Bruce instead to discuss business. Or maybe Bruce wanted Raymond Chow to come pick the couple up to drive them as a group to dinner with George Lazenby, thereby reducing any suggestion around a romance between Bruce Lee and Betty Ting Pei. Dinner was scheduled for 7:30 p.m. and Raymond Chow was in the apartment at 6 p.m. What happens next is critical and will help explain the circumstances of this tragic, but avoidable, death of Bruce Lee. Now I'm going to jump around a little bit over Bruce's medical history, his drug use, and the weather that day, but bear with me, because at the end of this, when we join the dots, you'll experience the same light bulb moment I too experienced when I looked at all the unique factors that, when combined, caused Bruce Lee to die. So let's get into it by starting with what may shock you, because it certainly was a smoking gun for me. Bruce Lee almost died some 10 weeks earlier from the same condition he ultimately died from, a cerebral edema. Yes, that's right. This wasn't Bruce Lee's first brush with cerebral edema. 10th of May 1973, the biggest red flag of all. The 10th of May 1973, some 10 weeks earlier before Bruce Lee died, found Bruce Lee re-recording dialogue for his latest movie, Enter the Dragon. It was a hot and humid day in Hong Kong, typical of late spring heading into summer. As was, and still is the custom in audio recording, small booths are used to maintain the quality of the recorded sound. On this day, sound engineers were finding that ventilation fans in the booth were interfering with the recording, so it was decided to turn these off to avoid impacting the recording. Bear in mind, back in the early 1970s, air conditioning was a novelty in Hong Kong. It wasn't until around 1973 onwards that air conditioning was gradually installed across Hong Kong, but in the early days it was limited to brand new top-end property developments. During recording, Bruce asked for a break and went to the toilets. After 20 minutes, a studio employee found Bruce in the toilets on the floor. Bruce said he was trying to find his glasses and made motions as if he was looking around. But it looked really weird, and it was a typical response from someone as proud and stubborn as Bruce Lee. It later turned out that Bruce had eaten cannabis in the toilets and had immediately fainted. Returning back to the small, hot studio to continue recording the dialogue, within a matter of minutes he collapsed again, vomited, and began convulsing. He was rushed to Hong Kong's Baptist Hospital unconscious and in a critical condition, where it was identified he had developed a cerebral edema. The signs were all there: seizures, vomiting, stupor, and loss of consciousness. He was literally moments away from death. Bruce Lee remained unconscious overnight, but under the care of very capable Hong Kong neurosurgeon Dr. Peter Wu, and he was treated with what is considered to be the gold star cerebral edema drug, mannitol. Dr. Peter Wu is quite a guarded individual, but he made it very clear to Bruce Lee that he had just escaped death by the thinnest of margins. What was the cause? Well, the answer here is a little bit hazy. Dr. Peter Wu advised Bruce he thought it was a reaction to the very strong hashish, known as Tibetan hashish, which is considered to be highly potent, that Bruce Lee was a regular user of. Dr. Peter Wu couldn't elaborate further, and therefore was speculating. But he had an opinion that Bruce Lee was hypersensitive to drugs, both illegal and legal. Why was this the case? How could Bruce be hypersensitive to drugs? Well, that part was unclear, but for Dr. Peter Wu, it was likely to be a process of elimination. So Dr. Wu may have asked, what was it that Bruce Lee had been doing differently that day that could have caused this accident? The obvious answer was consumption of hashish, and then afterwards Bruce Lee collapsed. So logically, it looked like Bruce Lee had a problem with hashish, and therefore the conclusion was drug hypersensitivity. But as you'll see shortly, I'll explain a theory on how Bruce came about to be hypersensitive to drugs, and how this should have been an early warning sign that something was seriously wrong with Bruce. Bruce wasn't public about his use of cannabis. After all, Hong Kong had, and still has, very strict drug laws. But when questioned by Dr. Peter Wu, he conceded he was actively using hashish. But let's put Bruce Lee's drug hypersensitivity aside. What is irrefutable is the extreme heat that Bruce was exposed to made for a perfect recipe for cerebral edema. Back in the early 1970s, not a lot was known about cerebral edemas, but with close to 50 years of medical scientific progress since then, a lot more is known now. And one of the confirmed factors that can result in cerebral edemas is heat stroke. When humans suffer from hyperthermia, which is the opposite of hypothermia, their body heat regulation goes haywire and is overwhelmed by outside factors. It can ultimately lead to swelling of the brain. On the topic of brains and swelling, it's important to remember, as we discussed earlier, that the skull has a limited amount of space available to the brain, cerebral spinal fluid, and blood. So if the brain swells, this causes intracranial pressure to build up, affecting the brain, the same intracranial pressure that can lead to cerebral edema. In Bruce's case, being stuck in a poorly ventilated box on a searingly hot day was enough to trigger hyperthermia, which in turn resulted in a cerebral edema. I believe that while Dr. Peter Will was right to call out Bruce's consumption of hashish, this was not the root cause of Bruce's cerebral edema. Instead, it was a clue to what was happening in Bruce's brain. Something undiagnosed and not well understood in 1972, known today as a leaky brain or a severely compromised blood-brain barrier. So the fact that Bruce had already had a cerebral edema should have been a big red flag to both Bruce and anyone close to him that he needed to be acutely focused on his health. Okay, so let's talk more about something I mentioned a few moments ago: leaky brains and blood-brain barriers. Epilepsy and leaky brains. Now I'm going to step into uncharted territory now, but Wong Shum Long, Bruce's former fellow student of Ip Man and sometime teacher and mentor too, revealed after Bruce Lee's death that Bruce had told him he had epilepsy as a child. Wong Shum Long is now dead, but in a video interview I recently watched with Wong Shum Long, he made this point very clear. Bruce Lee grew up with epilepsy. Now there's no verifiable proof as an adult that Bruce was explicitly treated for epilepsy, or indeed what triggers would cause Bruce to go into an epileptic fit. Commonly known triggers include tiredness, lack of sleep and stress, things that Bruce Lee experienced increasingly as his career gained momentum. No doctor has come out on the record and said that they were treating Bruce for epilepsy or he had a confirmed history of it, but someone close to Bruce Lee did corroborate Wong Shum Long's claim, at least that he was experiencing systemic convulsions throughout his life. Someone that would know Bruce Lee more intimately than most. At the inquest into her husband's death in 1973, Linda Lee, the widow of Bruce Lee, said Bruce Lee had a history of convulsions and he was taking Dilantin. Although she specifically called out that her husband had never been diagnosed with epilepsy, just convulsions. The thing is though, Dilantin is a common medication used for epilepsy. And in another interesting claim in 2006, Chicago coroner James Filkins put forward an opinion that Bruce Lee died directly as a consequence of an epileptic fit known as SUDEP, which stands for sudden, unexpected death in epilepsy. This condition requires an individual to already have epilepsy. Again, verifying that Bruce had epilepsy is challenging, but I still wonder why someone of such good standing like Wong Shum Long would make such a claim, particularly when he had no ulterior motive to gain from mentioning this. In short, he wasn't trying to claim that epilepsy killed Bruce Lee. Indeed, it wouldn't be something that the fitness fanatic, image-obsessed Bruce Lee would want the public to know. The notion that Bruce Lee was vulnerable and not as invincible as he led the world to think would damage his standing as a martial artist and action star in the 1970s. Whether Bruce Lee had epilepsy as a child, we'll never know for certain, but there's one important thing to call out with epilepsy, and that is the effect it has on the brain long term. There's a barrier that exists in the brain known as the blood-brain barrier. It is a physical and biochemical barrier which restricts and controls the exchange of molecules, ions, and cells between the brain and the blood system. In short, it takes what it needs from our blood system and leaves the rest behind. It's a critical function that surrounds our brain's blood vessels that prevents nasty stuff like pathogens and neurotoxins from getting into the brain, which means it protects our brain from diseases. It also acts as a dam wall for our brain, so thereby ensures that limited volumes of liquid like blood, water, and other solubles makes their way into the brain and doesn't cause intracranial pressure, the kind of intracranial pressure in the brain that leads to a cerebral edema. But here's the interesting thing. The blood-brain barrier can be damaged and therefore disrupted from doing its function effectively. In short, this barrier can be compromised. The disruptors? Well, they include traumatic brain injury, Alzheimer's, and epilepsy. Epilepsy-caused seizures interrupt the blood-brain barrier, which then leads to damage to the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. Why is this important? Well, when your blood-brain barrier is disrupted, it allows more fluids and bad stuff into the brain, which is known as leaky brain. The symptoms of a leaky brain include headaches and migraines, which grow more severe, mood disorders, including fits of rage and temper outbursts, and seizures. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Bruce Lee exhibited all of these symptoms. He regularly complained of bad headaches, and was known for his increasingly violent temper, particularly as his career grew, which he tried to self-medicate by using hashish, which he found calmed him down, or in other words, leveled him out. George Lazenby, the James Bond actor who had only just met Bruce Lee, remembers that Bruce repeatedly complained of headaches during the very limited time that they hung out together during the fateful trip that George made to Hong Kong in 1973. So we know there's a strong possibility that Bruce Lee's blood-brain barrier was compromised, and he developed symptoms consistent with this condition because of his apparent epilepsy. The more damage to the blood-brain barrier, the more vulnerable you are to fluid buildup because of a faulty blood-brain barrier, and the more easily drugs are able to be absorbed into the brain because the blood-brain barrier is compromised. Hence why Dr. Peter Wu, when treating Bruce Lee for his original cerebral edema, may have been on the right path when he believed Bruce's cerebral edema was caused, or at least contributed to, by his use of hashish. Except Dr. Peter Wu was walking in the wrong direction along this path and failing to ask, why would Bruce Lee be hypersensitive to hashish in the first place? And the answer is a compromised blood-brain barrier. So let's recap. We know that Bruce Lee had a previous episode of cerebral edema brought on by heat stroke. We know that Bruce Lee was vulnerable to the risk of intracranial pressure buildups, which lead to cerebral edemas because of his alleged epilepsy, which is a known disruptor to the blood-brain barrier. So the last factor at play on that fateful day on the 20th of July 1973 was the weather. So as I mentioned at the start of today's video, it was a really hot day in Hong Kong on the 20th of July 1973. Hong Kong can get unbearably hot during summer, and the 20th of July was no exception to this. By the middle of the day, the temperature was around 32 degrees Celsius or 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Yes, hot, but some would say not really hot compared to other countries like Australia, where 40+ degree temperatures are common during summer. But with Southeast Asia and the proximity to the equator, it gets humid, really humid. On this day, it was around 84% humidity in Hong Kong. So combine a warm sunny day of 32 degrees Celsius with humidity of 84%, and that adds up to a scorcher. In fact, taking this temperature and combining it with this humidity, the heat index temperature would feel more like 46 degrees Celsius or 117 degrees Fahrenheit. It was like a sauna that day in Hong Kong. This is heat stroke territory, and there's a hidden danger with high humidity climates. You don't feel as thirsty given the high air moisture content compared to more dry climates. This means it's easier to end up being dehydrated faster. Also, high humidity climates tend to drain our energy more quickly, and you end up feeling tired faster. So why is the weather so important for this tragedy? Well, remember the 10th of May 1973 when Bruce Lee experienced a cerebral edema. The weather was hot and humid, and add to this, Bruce spent time in an unventilated recording studio before he collapsed and was rushed to hospital, suffering from a cerebral edema which was linked to hyperthermia or heat stroke. We know that Bruce Lee had consumed hashish throughout the day on the 20th of July 1973, and the strength and pattern of consumption of hashish meant that his judgment and decision-making would have been impaired. Nothing to do with Bruce Lee, it's just what hashish does to anyone that uses it. We also know that Bruce Lee spent an extended afternoon at Betty Ting Pei's apartment, taking more hashish and having sex. Air conditioning was still not that common in Hong Kong in the early 1970s, and although it's never been confirmed, it's unlikely that Betty's one-bedroom apartment that had been built in 1970 had air conditioning installed. So it would have been pretty hot in Betty's apartment on that incredibly hot Hong Kong summer's afternoon. Then when Raymond Chow appeared, Bruce began rehearsing the script for his next movie, Game of Death, which was to feature George Lazenby. As Raymond Chow puts it, he was always active. In telling the story, he acted out the whole thing, so that probably made him a little tired and thirsty. After a few sips, he seemed to be a little dizzy. Immediately afterwards, Bruce started to feel faint, nauseous, and complained of a headache. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? These were similar symptoms that Bruce Lee had displayed some 10 weeks earlier. Even Raymond Chow that afternoon was also complaining of not feeling well. Could this be an objective insight on the part of Raymond Chow on the potency of the hot weather and ambient temperature in Betty's apartment that day? By 7:30 p.m, after Bruce Lee had exhausted himself, it was time to head out for dinner. But by this stage, Bruce was really struggling and said his headache had become worse and he wanted to rest instead. That's when Betty provided Bruce with the infamous Equagesic pill. But here's a key fact for your consideration. Betty Ting Pei was adamant that Bruce Lee had taken Equagesic before. In fact, Bruce Lee had taken aspirin throughout his life, and as Betty Ting Pei confirmed, he had used Equagesic on multiple occasions before. Surely it's obvious aspirin was never the culprit here and just a distraction for a more serious health condition. After taking Equagesic, Bruce went to Betty's bedroom and went to sleep, and by doing so, ended up sinking into unconsciousness and eventual death within probably an hour or two. I want to be clear here, I don't think Betty Ting Pei or Raymond Chow had any inkling of Bruce's impending death or the seriousness of this situation. For them, this was Bruce feeling unwell and it was something that would pass with some rest. And the terrible treatment and accusations made at the time by some in the media, and even to some extent today against both individuals, has been unfair and hurtful. But if anything, the one person that should have been alarmed and immediately insisted on going to hospital was Bruce Lee himself. He knew what had happened some 10 weeks earlier, he knew the symptoms and sensations he had experienced back then, and yet in typical Bruce Lee style, he wanted to fight it off. He believed his body was stronger than this. So let's come back to the afternoon and evening of the 20th of July 1973 and join the dots on the evidence I presented to you and look at this as a jury would look at a court case. First, we know the 20th of July 1973 was an extremely hot day. The heat index was hitting 46 degrees Celsius or 117 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a danger zone for heat stroke. Second, we know that Bruce is believed to have suffered from childhood epilepsy. He was also taking Dilantin, which is used to control epilepsy. Third, we know that Bruce was a regular cannabis user using the very potent Tibetan hashish. Fourth, we know that epilepsy is known to cause damage to the blood-brain barrier, that all-important barrier between the brain and the blood system in our bodies. When this barrier is compromised, this can lead to a condition known as leaky brain, which means that A, the blood-brain barrier is degraded in its ability to regulate and control the exchange of drugs between the blood system and the brain. This results in higher doses of both medication and drugs reaching the brain compared to a healthy blood-brain barrier. And B, the blood-brain barrier is unable to effectively control, compared to a healthy blood-brain barrier, the transmission of fluid into the brain. C, a leaky brain means that Bruce Lee would have been more predisposed towards cerebral edemas as his blood-brain barrier was not as effective at stopping fluid coming to his brain. His vulnerability to cerebral edema caused by a poor blood-brain barrier was demonstrated in his first cerebral edema in 1973. Sixth, Bruce had a previous history of cerebral edema when extreme temperatures and hashish was consumed. Now, I don't believe that hashish caused his cerebral edema. This was originally suggested by Dr. Peter Wu when he treated Bruce for his first cerebral edema, but he quickly backed away from this position after Bruce's death, and there are no medical studies to prove the correlation between cerebral edemas and cannabis consumption. Instead, the suggestion that Bruce Lee was apparently hypersensitive to hashish is more of a clue that something sinister was going on in Bruce Lee's body. But there are plenty of medical studies that have confirmed the connection between cerebral edemas and hypothermia caused by heat stroke due to extreme temperatures. So are you seeing what I'm seeing here? If I summarize it, it's this. Bruce Lee had a serious medical condition which was undiagnosed and not well understood in 1973. This condition, whether you call it leaky brain or a weak blood-brain barrier, meant that in specific situations where there was potential for increased intracranial pressure, like heat stroke, Bruce was more vulnerable to cerebral edema. Now we know that when Bruce Lee suffered from heat stroke or hypothermia, this resulted in a cerebral edema. We're not talking about extreme forms of heat stroke, by the way. It would have been enough for a very warm day to put Bruce Lee at risk of developing intracranial pressure and therefore a cerebral edema. Epilepsy was the main culprit for damaging his blood-brain barrier, which exacerbated his risk of developing cerebral edemas. His cannabis consumption also meant his ability to make clear judgments and decisions about his immediate health when experiencing the symptoms of a cerebral edema was impaired. Back in 1973, What we saw were misguided medical investigators looking for an easy to explain reason for Bruce Lee's controversial death. In this case, an easy explanation was an allergic reaction to aspirin or Equagesic. An allergic reaction to aspirin is rare but possible, and if taken and a severe reaction occurs, this results in anaphylaxis. Bruce Lee's autopsy found no evidence of anaphylactic shock. As I mentioned earlier, aspirin should be ruled out. It's not the culprit. Not only because there was no allergic reaction, but because Bruce Lee had taken aspirin all his adult life without any impacts. What we saw in 1973 was an attempt to find an easily identifiable cause for Bruce Lee's death without really exploring his medical history and what really transpired medically for Bruce Lee that July afternoon and evening in Hong Kong. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, and we now have the benefit of significant advancements in medical science to know that a combined set of circumstances played out. Specifically, hot weather combined with Bruce Lee's proven vulnerability to intracranial pressure because of a weak blood-brain barrier, which was compromised by epilepsy. And this meant that Bruce Lee was in the high-risk category for suffering cerebral edema. But ultimately, it wasn't cerebral edema that killed Bruce Lee. It was his own self-drive, overconfidence, and belief in his invincibility. He'd experienced one cerebral edema before and recovered from it, but still continued the same routines and behaviors that would in the end lead to his next cerebral edema and death. Bruce Lee thought he could never die, and for his fans, he will always be immortal. But this myth in the end caused him to make poor decisions about his well-being that resulted in the very preventable death of a martial artist, action movie star, and let's not forget a father, brother, son, husband, and friend to many. My hope with this video is you now have an alternative and realistic view that challenges both the historical view and your own personal view on how Bruce Lee died. If you like this video, then make sure to give it a like below and share with others who may be interested to learn more about Bruce Lee's death. And if you want to watch more videos like this one, make sure to subscribe to the More Than Legends channel. It would be an honor to have you as a subscriber. And finally, what's your view? Do you think that Bruce Lee's vulnerability to cerebral edemas because of a leaky brain caused his death? Leave me a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for tuning in.